Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we drift back to the time of the plague, a world of silence, smoke, and uneasy air. People lived in fear, yet still tried, in small ways, to stay clean, to hold on to a sense of order, even as sickness spread. Together, we will move slowly through daily life, the sights, the sounds, the smells, and the quiet contrasts between rich and poor. This is not a story of drama, but of endurance, told gently to help you rest. And before we begin, I kindly invite you to subscribe to The Boring Historian. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, let us begin. Close your eyes now. Imagine yourself stepping softly into the narrow streets of a medieval town during the years when the plague hung in the air like a shadow. The world you are entering is not silent, though it feels subdued. Life continues, though more carefully, more quietly. The first thing you notice is not the sight, but the smell. The streets are lined with stone and dirt, and in the shallow gutters that run along their sides, refuse collects. Scraps of vegetables, fish bones, and the sweepings of straw from household floors are tossed into the open air. The scent is heavy, a mix of sour cabbage, stale ale, and the musk of damp earth. At times, it sharpens into something harsher, the tents of urine emptied from chamber pots, or the sour reek of spoiled milk. But there is also the comforting smell of wood smoke. Every home, whether poor and small or grand and wealthy, keeps a fire burning. Da-da-da-da. The scent of oak or pine drifts gently from the chimneys, mingling with the other smells and softening them, if only slightly. On certain mornings, you may also catch the aroma of bread, its crust baking golden in the communal oven. It is a fleeting sweetness, quickly drowned in the stronger odors of the town. The ground beneath your feet is uneven. Cobblestones are smooth in some places, slippery where rain has fallen and broken in others. When your steps land on straw scattered at a doorway, it crunches softly, muffling the sound. A cart creaks in the distance, its wooden wheels groaning as it rolls forward. The steady clop of a donkey's hooves echoes through the narrow lane, sharp against the stone walls. Voices carry lightly on the air. A woman calls out to her child, her tone weary but tender. A vendor tries to sell onions, his voice thin, his words repeated over and over like a chant. Yet there are fewer voices than there once were. Many doors remain closed, windows are shuttered. Fear of illness keeps people inside. The silence that follows is not peaceful, but heavy, almost pressing against your ears. If you pass by the poorer homes, you will see wooden walls patched with mud and straw, their roofs sagging with damp. Inside, families live in a single room, sometimes sharing space with chickens or a goat. The smell of animals drifts outward, warm, musky, and sharp. Water is scarce, and washing is rare. Clothing grows stiff with use, carrying the odors of sweat, smoke, and labor. In contrast, the wealthier homes stand taller. Their walls are stone, their doors heavy with iron hinges. Servants sweep the floors and scatter herbs, lavender, rosemary, or mint. Across the rushes, as you pass, a faint freshness greets your nose, a sharp, clean scent rising when footsteps brush the herbs. The wealthy use perfumes and rose water to mask the smells of the body. Yet even here, in their comfort, true cleanliness is elusive. The air is still thick, the shadows still heavy. Church bells toll in the distance, their sound deep and solemn. Each slow strike of the bell seems to carry through the air like a heartbeat, steady and unchanging. The sound mingles with the caw of crows circling above the rooftops, their cries harsh and unwelcoming. Dogs bark from the alleys, low and restless, while a cat slips silently along a wall, its paws soundless on the stone. For a moment, pause and imagine standing still in the middle of that street. The air is cool, damp from the morning mist. A droplet of water slides from a roof and splashes softly at your feet. The scent of vinegar drifts from a doorway where someone has sprinkled it, hoping it will cleanse the air. You hear the soft murmur of a prayer carried on the breeze, a whispered plea for protection against the sickness that no one can see. This was the daily atmosphere of medieval towns during the plague. It was not only the disease itself that burdened the people, but the constant presence of filth, odor, and unease. For the poor, survival meant enduring the closeness of dirt and waste, their lives wrapped in smells they could not escape. For the rich, survival meant surrounding themselves with herbs, perfumes, and servants to sweep and cleanse, though even these comforts could not shield them entirely. And so every street was a reminder of the struggle for cleanliness. The smells told the story of class, of hardship, and of hope. The sounds, the bells, the carts, the footsteps carried a rhythm of endurance, slow and steady, moving forward even as the shadow of plague hung overhead. Let this image settle in your mind. The quiet street, the mingling of harsh and pleasant scents, the slow sounds echoing against stone walls.
Ow.
This was the world in which men and women tried in small ways to stay clean. A world of contrasts, of fears, and of endurance. And now, we will move gently into the next part of our journey, the rituals of bathing and the fears people held about the water itself. In our time, bathing is often a daily act of refreshment, a way of feeling clean and renewed. But in the plague years of the Middle Ages, bathing carried with it more than a simple sense of comfort. It carried fear. To bathe was not only an act of cleansing, but in many minds, an act of risk. Imagine again the world of the 14th century. Water was not always trusted. The physicians and learned men of the time believed in a theory called miasma, the idea that sickness spread through bad air, through vapors and unseen poisons carried in the breeze. When the skin was opened by warm water, it was thought, the pores became wide and vulnerable, and disease could slip inside the body as easily as smoke through an open window. And so, many feared bathing too often. A full immersion in water could leave the body exposed. Instead, small rituals took its place: the careful wiping of the face with a damp cloth, the rinsing of hands before meals, or the sprinkling of scented water across clothing rather than the body itself. These small gestures gave a feeling of order, of cleanliness, without the danger that people believed a full bath might bring. Yet bathing did exist, and in certain places it was still practiced with care. In towns, bathhouses stood like quiet sanctuaries. Their doors opened into rooms where steam rose and the sound of water dripping echoed softly against wooden beams. Inside, a visitor might lower themselves into a wooden tub, the warm water swirling around them, the scent of herbs such as rosemary or sage rising with the steam. It was soothing, yes, but always shadowed by the worry of contagion. To share a bathhouse was to share water with strangers, and in a time when sickness spread invisibly, this was a risk that many could no longer take. For the poor, a bathhouse was often out of reach. Their bathing was simple, carried out in a wooden tub at home, if at all. The water had to be fetched by hand, bucket by bucket, from a well or stream. Heated slowly over a fire, it was poured into the tub until it reached a shallow depth. Families sometimes shared this same water, one after another, the warmth fading, the clarity clouding. By the end, the bath was less about cleanliness and more about ritual, a small reminder that the body could be tended to, even if imperfectly. For the wealthy, bathing could be an elaborate affair. In grand homes, servants filled large tubs of polished wood or even lined with cloth. The water might be perfumed with rose petals, sprinkled with spices like cinnamon or cloves, or softened with oils that made the skin smooth. Attendants stood nearby with cloths and brushes ready to pour warm water gently over their master's shoulders. The air in such a chamber would carry a faint sweetness, a mixture of warm water, flower petals, and the flicker of beeswax candles. And yet, even here, fear crept in. Physicians warned against too much bathing, advising instead the rubbing of the body with cloths, or the wearing of linen undergarments that could soak up sweat and keep the skin pure. For many, simple change of clothes was seen as safer than immersing in water. Linen was thought to draw impurities out of the skin, and so, to change one's underclothes was a kind of cleansing ritual in itself. In both rich and poor households, herbs played a central role. People burned them, scattered them, soaked them in water, and used them in washing. A poor villager might steep sage or thyme in a small basin, using the scented water to wipe their face. A noble might be washed with water infused with lavender or rose, the scent masking the smells of the body and offering reassurance against the invisible threat of disease. Still, fear lingered. Too much bathing was dangerous, it was said, for water could weaken the body. Even warm baths were thought to soften the skin, opening it to harmful vapors. And so the act of washing became less about thorough cleansing and more about balance. Enough to feel refreshed, but not so much as to invite sickness. Listen for a moment to the sound of such a ritual. A wooden bucket set gently on the floor, the creak of a stool as someone sits beside the tub, the soft splash of water poured into a basin, the whisper of cloth against skin as a face is wiped, a hand is rinsed, or a brow is cooled with damp linen. These sounds so small, so ordinary, were the music of medieval bathing, careful, quiet, and tinged with caution. The contrast between classes was clear. For the poor, bathing was rare and simple, a chore often set aside when survival demanded other labors. For the wealthy, it was ritualized, perfumed, and accompanied by attendants. Yet both shared the same worry, that water itself, meant to cleanse, could instead invite death. And so, bathing became a symbol of the age, an act of comfort shadowed by dread. Cleanliness was never simple. It was always complicated, always uncertain, always weighed against the invisible threat of plague. Let this thought settle gently in your mind. A world where water itself was both healing and dangerous, where the act of washing carried with it both relief and fear. And as you rest with this image, we will soon drift into the next chapter. The world of soaps, herbs, and the strange practices people used to stay clean during the plague years. When we think of staying clean, soap often comes to mind. A bar of smooth, scented substance that lathers into bubbles. But during the time of the plague, soap was not always as familiar or as common as it is today. It existed, yes, but in forms and uses that might surprise us. And it was often joined by herbs, spices, and curious rituals that served as substitutes for true washing. Imagine a small workshop in a medieval town. The smell that rises here is sharp and almost unpleasant. Soap was often made from animal fats, tallow from sheep or cattle, mixed with lye, a caustic substance derived from ashes. The mixture was boiled down, stirred slowly in great cauldrons, and then left to cool into hard, rough blocks. The scent of such soap was not the gentle fragrance we expect today. Instead, it was earthy, greasy, with a hint of smoke and sharpness. Using it left the skin clean, yes, but also dry, rough, and carrying the lingering odor of its making. For the poor, such soap was a rarity. A household might possess a single bar, used sparingly and treasured for its ability to cut through grease or dirt. It was more often applied to clothing than to the body. Rough woolen garments were scrubbed against wooden boards with soap and water, then hung in the air to dry. The smell of wet wool mixed with lye filled the lanes where laundry hung. For washing the body, water alone, or water infused with herbs, was more common than soap. The wealthy, on the other hand, could afford finer versions. Their soap might be softened with olive oil, perfumed with rosemary, or laced with rose water. The bars were smoother, easier on the skin, and far more pleasant in scent. To wash with such soap was almost a luxury, more a ritual of refinement than of necessity. But even with soap, people turned constantly to herbs. Herbs were thought not only to cleanse, but to protect. A sprig of lavender tied to a belt, a sachet of rosemary hung around the neck, or a bundle of sage burned in the hearth. All were believed to drive away bad air, and thus disease. The scent was strong, sharp, and refreshing, cutting through the foul smells of the street. To walk through a town was to pass by doorways where herbs hung drying, their leaves curling, their fragrance softening with time. Herbs were also infused into water for washing. Imagine a basin filled with warm liquid, the surface scattered with thyme leaves. A cloth is dipped, wrung out until it drips softly, then pressed to the skin. The water is not only soothing, but the rising scent gives a sense of comfort and protection. For the wealthy, such infusions might include costly spices like cinnamon or cloves, carried across seas from distant lands. The water would glow with color and aroma, as if richness itself could keep sickness at bay. Strange practices also filled this world of cleanliness. Vinegar was a favorite remedy. People rinsed their hands with it, wiped their tables with it, even soaked sponges in it to hold to their faces when walking through crowded streets. The smell was strong, sour, almost biting in the nose, and it brought reassurance, a sense that the air could be purified by its sharpness. Smoke was another. Fires were stoked not only for warmth but for cleansing. In homes, herbs and spices were tossed into the flames, sending up clouds of fragrant smoke. The air grew heavy with sage, rosemary, or pine resin. People walked through the smoke deliberately, letting it cling to their clothing, believing it shielded them from invisible poisons. In some cases, even animal dung was burned, its acrid scent thought to push away the miasma of plague. There were also rituals that bordered on the curious. Some believed in rubbing the body with vinegar and ashes, creating a rough paste that scoured the skin. Others suggested washing with urine, sharp and acrid, as a way to cleanse impurities. To modern ears, these methods sound unpleasant, but in a world where disease spread silently, any practice that promised protection was worth trying. Consider for a moment the sensory world of such cleansing. A wooden bucket of water, the surface shimmering with floating herbs, the cool touch of a damp cloth on the forehead, the sour sting of vinegar against the hands, the smoky curl of sage filling a darkened room. These were the textures and scents that formed the daily battle against dirt and disease. The contrast between rich and poor was sharp here as well. Poor relied on simple herbs gathered from fields, wild thyme plucked from hillsides, or nettles steeped in hot water. Their cleansing was rough, practical, and limited. The wealthy, however, surrounded themselves with imported spices, perfumed oils, and soap, refined with fine ingredients. To them, cleanliness was not only survival, but also display, a sign of wealth, refinement, and superiority over the common folk. And yet, plague respected neither wealth nor poverty. Perfumed soap and rough lye alike could not shield against it. The herbs, the vinegar, the smoke, they gave comfort, but not true protection. Still, the rituals endured, for they gave people something to do, something to cling to, something to believe in. As you let your thoughts drift here, imagine the quiet room of a medieval home. The faint glow of firelight, small basin on a wooden table, steam rising gently from water scented with sage. A hand dips the cloth, wrings it slowly, and presses it to tired skin. Outside, the air is heavy with fear, but inside, there is this small act of care. This was how people tried to stay clean, in the simplest, strangest ways, during the long shadow of plague. And now, let us move softly forward. To the men who played a curious role in both grooming and cleanliness, the barbers and bathhouse attendants, who shaped daily hygiene in unexpected ways. In the centuries of the Black Plague, when fear of unseen forces shaped daily routines, barbers and bathhouse attendants held curious roles within the fragile framework of hygiene. A barber was not just a man with scissors and a razor. He was surgeon, healer, and caretaker in a world where medicine was more guesswork than science. He might bleed a patient to release bad humors, or draw out a tooth with steady, practiced hands. His small wooden shop often carried the sharp smell of iron and herbs, a place where the sick and the healthy alike came to seek relief. Bathhouse attendants, in contrast, presided over spaces where warmth and water promised comfort. The bathhouse was a place to cleanse the skin, to share news, and to briefly escape the dirt and dust of medieval streets. Attendants labored constantly, stoking fires to heat great cauldrons, carrying buckets, and scattering herbs into the water to sweeten the air. Yet during outbreaks of plague, suspicion turned upon these spaces. Many feared that bathing opened the pores, leaving the body vulnerable to poisoned air. The bathhouse, once a refuge, became a place of unease. Still, both barbers and attendants persisted in their work. They offered small rituals of care in a time of dread, trimming hair, warming water, and easing discomfort where they could. In their hands, cleanliness, however imperfect, became a fragile shield against the darkness of the age. Clothing during the time of the plague was more than fabric stitched together. It was a second skin, often worn for long stretches before it ever met water or soap. In villages, towns, and crowded cities, laundry was a constant struggle, and for many, a near impossible task. The poor often owned only a single set of garments. Wool tunics, heavy with sweat and grime, were worn day after day, season after season, until they frayed at the seams. Linen undergarments, if a family could afford them, soaked up the body's oils and odors. When washed, were scrubbed against wooden boards in cold, harsh streams. The act of laundry was laborious. Women bent over wash tubs, their hands reddened by icy water in winter or by lye soap in warmer months. the smell was rarely pleasant. Lye soap itself, sharp and acrid, stung the nose, while wet wool released an earthy, almost sour odor. Steam rose from pots when clothes were boiled to kill lice, filling the air with a mingling of smoke, soap, and damp cloth. Around them, the sounds of splashing water, the creak of wooden tubs, and the slap of wet garments carried through narrow alleys. For the wealthy, cleanliness was easier to maintain. Fine linen chemises were replaced more frequently, handed over to servants for careful washing. Great houses had laundresses, often working in drafty, smoke-filled rooms, where hot water was heated in iron pots and garments hung on racks to dry. Even so, perfumes and scented sachets often masked what soap and water could not fully remove. Musk, rose, oil, and lavender were carried in small pouches, pressed between folds of clothing, meant to fight the ever-present smells of the medieval world. Yet in the shadow of the plague, clothing itself became a source of fear. It was believed that fabric absorbed the foul, corrupted air. People whispered that woolen cloaks and linen sleeves might carry death from house to house. Garments of the dead were sometimes burned, though the poor, desperate for warmth, often wore them still. The struggle for cleanliness, then, was not simply about appearance, but about survival. Each shirt scrubbed, each cloak boiled, was a fragile attempt to push back against the encroaching dread of disease. In the rhythm of washing and drying, in the crackling of fires and the scent of herbs tucked into sleeves, there was a small act of defiance, a way to cling to a sense of order in a world turned upside down. In the long shadow of the Black Plague, cleanliness became not only a matter of survival, but also a clear mark of one's place in society. Hygiene was never equal, and in the 14th century, when plague spread with terrifying speed, the differences between the wealthy and the poor were visible in the most ordinary routines. To explore this contrast is to walk through two very different worlds, one of stone manors and perfumed chambers, and another of cramped huts and unwashed garments. For the poor, daily life was a constant struggle against dirt. In villages, peasants rose with the sun to labor in the fields, their hands thick with soil, their feet hardened by mud. Water was drawn from streams or communal wells, often shared with animals, and rarely fresh by modern standards. Washing was practical, limited, and never thorough. Faces and hands might be rinsed before meals, but full baths were rare. Single shift of linen might serve as underclothing for weeks at a time, only scrubbed clean when it could no longer be endured. The smell of sweat, damp wool, and earth followed the poor everywhere. Mingling with the smoke of their hearths and the sourness of unwashed bodies crowded together in small wooden homes. Contrast this with the wealthy, whose approach to cleanliness was wrapped in ceremony and ritual.
Ow.
In grand halls and bedchambers, water was poured into gleaming basins by servants, warmed and perfumed with herbs. Noblemen and women washed their faces and hands several times a day, not from scientific understanding, but as a sign of refinement. To smell of lavender, rosewater, or musk was to show distance from the filth of the common world. Bathing for the rich was less frequent than for the poor laundress, scrubbing clothes by the river. But it was grander in scale. Heated bathwater was carried to chambers or prepared in private rooms, sometimes scattered with petals or medicinal herbs. Bath attendants massaged the skin with cloths, while barbers trimmed hair and beards to maintain an air of order and dignity. Yet in both worlds, fear seeped in during the plague years. It was believed that water opened the pores and left the body vulnerable to the corrupted air, the miasma that carried sickness. For the poor, who could rarely afford more than a cold dip in a stream, this belief mattered little. They bathed infrequently anyway. But for the rich, whose very status was displayed through rituals of washing and bathing, this belief shifted habits. Perfumes, powders, and scented cloths became substitutes for water. Rather than cleansing the body, they covered the odors of human life, building a fragile shield of fragrance against disease. Still, poverty left deeper marks. A poor laborer's clothing might be boiled only when lice and fleas became unbearable. Yet these very insects carried plague from one home to the next. Families often shared beds, children pressed close to parents, breath mingling in the night, with no means to escape contagion. In contrast, the wealthy retreated into isolation. Great households shut their doors, burning sweet-smelling woods like juniper or rosemary to ward off foul air. Servants were sent to clean floors with vinegar, or to fumigate rooms with smoke, rituals that soothed the mind more than the body. But wealth could not guarantee safety. The plague struck noble courts as easily as peasant huts, though the experience differed. The poor died where they lived, their bodies wrapped in rough cloth carried to crowded pits. The rich were prepared with oils, incense, and prayers, buried in consecrated ground, their bodies tended with more ceremony. Even in death, cleanliness and decay were marked by class. The difference in hygiene practices also shaped how communities looked upon each other. The wealthy often saw the poor as unclean, their dirt and labor as evidence of moral weakness. Yet the plague blurred these lines. The rich, doused in rosewater and dressed in silks, still fell to the same coughing, the same blackened swellings as the field worker or the washerwoman. Dirt, perfume, labor, or leisure, none offered true protection. And so, in the stillness of those dark years, people clung to what small measures they could. The poor boiled their clothes in cauldrons, scoured wooden bowls with sand, or rinsed hands before a meal. The wealthy burned spices, washed in scented basins, and instructed servants to air out their garments beneath the open sky. Each group, in its own way, sought a fragile sense of order, a small act of defiance against the chaos that surrounded them. The streets reflected these contrasts, too. A poor alley, narrow and damp, stank of waste, rotting straw, and the closeness of bodies. Chickens clucked, dogs barked, children cried, and the sound of water sloshed in buckets marked the rhythm of daily chores. The wealthy quarter, by contrast, carried the softer sense of herbs and perfumes, though beneath them lay the same reality: rot, death, and the ever-present hum of flies. The sound of carts on cobbles, the clatter of hooves, and the distant toll of church bells echoed over both worlds, reminders that life and death were never far apart. The Black Plague made hygiene into a mirror of inequality, yet also a shared human struggle. Whether through boiled rags or perfumed gloves, whether with cold water from a stream or warm basins filled by servants, people sought to preserve dignity in the face of fear. The rich and the poor lived in different textures, different scents, different daily rituals, but both were bound by the same invisible enemy, and both discovered in time that no fragrance, no garment, no ritual of washing could fully guard them. Still, these practices remind us of the persistence of ordinary life. Even when death loomed, people washed their hands, scrubbed their clothing, boiled their linens, and lit fires scented with herbs. These small acts, rooted in class, yet shared across it, were gestures of hope. They were reminders that even in the darkest times, humanity searched for cleanliness, for comfort, and for a way to endure. When the Black Plague swept across Europe in the 14th century, it did more than strike down bodies, unsettled minds, unmoored traditions, and made faith itself seem fragile. In a world without modern medicine, people turned to the spiritual for answers, for comfort, and for the possibility of protection. Religious beliefs became deeply entwined with the way people approached cleanliness, purification, and the rituals of daily life. For ordinary villagers, the church was not only a place of prayer, but also a guidebook for survival. Priests spoke of sin and penance, urging their flocks to cleanse their souls as well as their bodies. Many believed the plague was God's punishment, a chastisement for greed, lust, and the corruption of mankind. In such a view, hygiene was not simply about washing dirt from one's hands. It was about purifying the spirit. A basin of holy water at the church door offered more reassurance than any bucket at home. Each touch, each sign of the cross, was believed to scrub away invisible stains of sin. Among the poor, purification was often tied to communal rituals. Processions wound through villages and towns, men and women chanting prayers, sometimes wearing plain garments of sackcloth. They walked barefoot in the dust, heads bowed as priests sprinkled holy water or swung censers heavy with incense. The smoke of frankincense and myrrh mingled with the sour scent of sweat and earth. This was purification through ritual, not through soap. The smell of incense was thought to drive away not only demons, but also the pestilential air. For the wealthy, purification was practiced with greater ceremony. Noble households held private masses, their chapels lit with beeswax candles, the air thick with sweet smoke. Lords and ladies might wear small reliquaries or amulets filled with saints' relics, believing that holy fragments could guard them from contagion. Bathing itself could become a spiritual act. Water blessed by a priest was poured into tubs, sometimes mingled with herbs like rosemary or thyme, believed to carry protective power. To bathe in such water was not merely to wash the body, but to soak away invisible dangers. Yet fear of water grew as plague persisted. Many believed that water opened the pores, allowing disease to slip inside. Instead, purification was sought through fumigation, fire, and faith. Homes were filled with smoke from burning juniper, sage, or resin, each flame accompanied by whispered prayers. Families might kneel together as a priest walked from room to room, sprinkling holy water onto walls and hearthstones. These rituals blurred the line between hygiene and devotion, making the physical act of cleansing inseparable from the spiritual. The Church also prescribed fasting and abstinence as forms of purification. To cleanse the body of excess, people reduced their meals to bread, fish, or thin broth. Hunger was endured as a sacrifice, a way of emptying oneself of corruption. Pilgrimages were undertaken to journeys across muddy roads and windswept fields, to shrines believed to hold miraculous power. At these holy places, pilgrims washed in sacred springs, their hands trembling in cold water as they prayed for deliverance. One of the most striking rituals of the plague years was that of the flagellants. Groups of men, often barefoot and dressed in simple robes, walked from town to town. They carried whips tipped with iron or knotted cords, striking their own backs in rhythmic unison. The sound of leather on flesh echoed through village streets, accompanied by hymns and cries of repentance. Blood marked their shoulders, mingling with dust and sweat, a grim attempt to cleanse society of sin through suffering. Onlookers watched in silence or joined the chants, believing that each lash was an offering to God, a plea for protection against the plague. For many, this extreme act of purification was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a public demonstration of desperation in the face of unseen death. But not all rituals were grand. In countless homes, small acts carried meaning. Mothers traced the sign of the cross over their children's foreheads before bed, whispering blessings as they tucked them into straw-filled mattresses. Farmers sprinkled their fields with holy water, hoping to keep crops safe from the taint of disease. Travelers carried small pouches filled with blessed salt or dried herbs, clutching them when passing through plague-stricken villages. These quiet practices reflected a simple truth. Purification was not only for the body, but for the soul, and each act was a way to feel less helpless. The contrast between rich and poor could be seen here too. The wealthy could afford elaborate rituals, with private chaplains, richly embroidered altar cloths, and barrels of wine used for sacred blessing. The poor made do with what they had: a single candle, a handful of dried rosemary, a wooden cross above the door. Yet both shared the same longing to feel clean, safe, and favored in the eyes of God. In the end, religious purification was less about washing away dirt and more about creating a sense of order in a disordered world. The ringing of church bells, the murmured prayers, the sweet smoke of incense, the chill of holy water on the skin all. These were reminders that, even as death lingered at the door, people could still take action. They could still cleanse, still hope, still endure. In the quiet after a ritual, when the incense thinned and the candles burned low, there was often a brief sense of peace, a sense that for a moment, however fleeting, the air was lighter, the world safer, and the plague kept at bay. These moments of calm, born of belief, became part of daily life, carrying people through the long nights of fear. And so, during the Black Plague, cleanliness and faith intertwined. Purification was not only soap and water, but incense and prayer, fasting and pilgrimage, blessing and sacrifice. It was a fragile shield, made not of science but of faith. And though it could not halt the plague, it soothed weary minds, reminding people that they were not powerless, even in the face of death. To imagine the bathhouse in the time of the plague, one must step softly into a world both familiar and foreign a place, where water, warmth, and human presence mingled together in ways that carried comfort as well as unease. Bathhouses had long been part of medieval towns, surviving as a tradition passed down from the Roman world. And by the 14th century, they remained central to both hygiene and social life. Yet when the plague crept through the streets, The bathhouse became more than a place of cleansing. It became a stage where fear and necessity met. The first thing one noticed was the sound. From outside, the bathhouse hummed with life. Buckets of water splashed as attendants hurried back and forth. Fires crackled under great copper cauldrons, their heat rising into the rafters. The low murmur of voices spilled out into the narrow streets, men and women talking, laughing, sighing as they lowered themselves into steaming pools. The rhythm of wooden clogs on stone floors echoed through the chamber, while the constant dripping of water created a slow, hypnotic backdrop. It was a place alive with movement, yet softened by the mist that blurred all edges. Stepping inside, the air enveloped the visitor at once, heavy, moist, and thick with mingled smells. The sharp tang of wood smoke from the heating fires clung to the walls. Steam carried the earthy scent of damp wood, and wet woolen garments hung to dry on pegs. Herbal mixtures, rosemary, thyme, mint floated in the water, attempting to sweeten the air, though not always successfully. Beneath these notes lay the undeniable human odors of sweat, skin, and unwashed bodies, faintly masked but never entirely gone. The bathhouse was both cleansing and unclean at once, a contradiction that many accepted because it was all they knew. For the poor, the bathhouse was a rare escape. In their own homes, there was no space, no firewood, no water enough to waste on comfort. A single tub, if it existed, was shared by many. But in the bathhouse, for a small coin, they could sink into heated water, let weariness drift from their muscles, and feel for a little while as if life was lighter. Children splashed in shallower pools, their laughter mingling with the low conversations of their parents. Laborers sat shoulder to shoulder, discussing the harvest or the price of bread, while steam softened the harsh lines of their faces. The wealthy experienced the bathhouse differently. Some visited public establishments, arriving with attendants who carried fine towels and jars of scented oils. Others had private bath chambers within their manors, where marble tubs were filled by servants with water infused with herbs or even milk. In either setting, bathing became an act of leisure and refinement. Nobles reclined in heated pools, sipping spiced wine or nibbling sweetmeats, the flickering candlelight glinting on their jewelry. For them, the bath was not simply about hygiene, but about display, ritual, and the indulgence of comfort in uncertain times. Yet the shadow of the plague altered these spaces. Physicians and clerics warned that the heat of baths opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to the poisoned air believed to carry disease. The very mist that once soothed the skin became a cause of suspicion. Some bathhouses closed entirely, their doors barred, their fires extinguished. Others continued, though with fewer visitors, the voices inside quieter, the laughter thinner. Attendants, once brisk and confident, moved more cautiously, their hands red from the constant carrying of buckets and the scrubbing of floors with vinegar in hopes of purification. Still, for those who dared enter, the atmosphere of the bathhouse remained strangely comforting. To step into warm water was to forget, if only for a time, the silence of empty streets and the tolling of funeral bells. The closeness of other bodies, the steady rhythm of conversation, created an illusion of normalcy. People compared remedies, spoke of neighbors, whispered prayers, or shared the latest rumors of the plague's advance. In this shared space, fear was tempered by companionship, and cleansing became a communal act of resistance. The textures of the bathhouse added to its atmosphere. Rough wooden benches lined the walls, damp from use. Towels, coarse and scratchy, were stacked in bundles, their fibers stiff with repeated washing. And the stone floor was slick beneath bare feet, smoothed by generations of use. Steam clung to skin, beating on arms and faces, while the water itself, warm at first, slowly cooled, leaving behind a faintly greasy sheen. All these details made the bathhouse a sensory world of its own, one that lingered in memory long after the visitor departed. For some, the bathhouse was more than practical. It carried a spiritual undertone. Bathing was linked in scripture to renewal and purity, and priests sometimes blessed the waters, mingling holy ritual with earthly cleansing. Herbs added to the pools were believed not only to scent the air, but to ward off sickness, carrying protective properties passed down through generations. The act of submerging oneself could feel like both washing and prayer, an intimate ritual of survival in uncertain times. And yet not all looked kindly on these places. Moralists condemned them as sites of temptation and sin, for men and women sometimes bathed together, and laughter carried easily through the mist. To some, the bathhouse was a den of indulgence, a distraction from repentance in a time when repentance was believed to be the only true cure. This suspicion grew sharper during outbreaks of plague, when any gathering place seemed dangerous, even sinful. Despite these fears, the bathhouse lingered in memory as a place of warmth during a cold and uncertain age. It was where laborers soaked away pain, where nobles displayed refinement, where families sought comfort, and where fear itself was momentarily washed aside by steam and companionship. To walk into a medieval bathhouse during the plague was to step into a world of contrasts, cleansing and contamination, comfort and suspicion, pleasure and dread. In the hush that followed, a long soak, as bodies dried with coarse linen and the fires burned lower, a quiet peace sometimes descended. The chatter softened, the steam thinned, and for a moment, the plague felt far away. This fleeting calm was perhaps the greatest gift of the bathhouse, not simply the washing of the skin, but the gentle easing of the mind, a fragile reminder that even in the darkest years, people still sought warmth, comfort, and renewal. When the plague swept across Europe, it was not only the disease itself that shaped people's lives, but also the constant suffocating fear of contagion. The air, the water, the clothing, even the very breath of one's neighbor, everything was suspect. It was a time when daily existence unfolded under the shadow of pestilence, and the fear of catching it was as heavy as the sickness itself. In the minds of most, disease did not move invisibly from flea to man, or rat to household. Instead, people imagined it as a corruption of the air, a poisoned breath that drifted through streets and fields. This belief, known as miasma theory, filled every moment with suspicion. A gentle breeze could be comforting, or it could be deadly. The sweet smell of herbs gave hope, while the rank odor of decay was thought to carry death itself. Smell and sight were their guides, and the senses became tools of survival. For the poor, fear of contagion meant watching every corner of their small homes. They stuffed cracks in their walls with straw, hung herbs above their doors, and burned whatever they could, wood, resin, even scraps of cloth, to cleanse the air with smoke. Families huddled together, whispering prayers as they listened to the tolling of church bells announcing yet another death. The smell of smoke lingered on their clothing, clung to their hair, a constant reminder of their attempts to guard themselves, and still the fear remained. The wealthy responded differently, though their fear was no less real. Nobles retreated into their estates, shutting gates and forbidding strangers from entering. Servants were sent to fetch water or food, their clothing fumigated upon return with vinegar or smoke before they could step inside. Rooms were filled with the scent of juniper, rosemary, and burning herbs, each fragrance intended to push back the pestilential air. Physicians, hired at great expense, devised lords and ladies to carry pomander small orbs, filled with spices and perfumes that could be lifted to the nose when walking through suspect air. In their perfumed halls, the rich found fragile comfort. But even within these guarded walls, the fear of contagion seeped in. The streets carried this fear most visibly. Markets grew quieter as fewer dared gather. Conversations took place at a distance. Voices lowered, eyes darting nervously to any cough or sneeze. Children were pulled back by their mothers if a stranger passed too closely. The sight of a body cart rolling by, piled with the shrouded dead, silenced entire alleys. People pressed cloths to their faces or retreated into their homes, shutting windows as though wood and stone might hold back death. Barbers and bathhouse attendants, once trusted for their small acts of care, were suddenly seen as possible dangers. Who knew what air they breathed in their work, or what illnesses clung to the damp floors of bathhouses? Laundresses, too, were watched with suspicion. Handling the garments of others, touching sweat-soaked linens, they seemed both necessary and dangerous at once. The very people who sought to keep others clean became, in the eyes of many, bearers of risk. Religious responses added to this atmosphere of fear. Priests warned that sin itself was contagious, that one person's corruption could bring ruin to an entire town. Processions of penitents filled the streets, some carrying crosses, others chanting prayers for deliverance. The flagellants, with their whips and cries, dramatized this belief, purging not only their own sins but those of entire communities. Watching them pass, many villagers felt both awe and dread, uncertain whether such acts cleansed or spread further danger. Even clothing bore the weight of contagion. It was believed that fabric absorbed the poisoned air. Garments of the dead were often burned, the flames sending acrid smoke into the sky. But the poor, unable to part with precious clothing, sometimes wore them still. The feel of coarse wool against the skin, once merely uncomfortable, now carried an added layer of dread. Could this cloak, this sleeve, this worn linen shift carry death to the household? The question haunted every gesture of dressing and undressing. In some towns, laws were passed to manage contagion. Strangers were barred from entering without inspection. Homes of the sick were marked and sometimes sealed. Whole families were locked within, the sound of their voices muffled behind shutters, their fates sealed by suspicion alone. Fires were lit in the streets, great piles of wood and herbs burned in hopes that the smoke would purify the air. The crackling flames filled the night, their glow reflected in fearful eyes peering from windows. And yet, amidst all this fear, life persisted. The smell of bread still rose from ovens in the morning. The cries of market sellers still rang out, though softer than before. Children still played in courtyards, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. But beneath every ordinary sound and smell lay the unspoken question. Was contagion hiding here too? The fear of pestilence reshaped the senses themselves. A sneeze was no longer a simple bodily act, but a warning. The smell of rot was not only unpleasant, but a harbinger of death. Even the touch of a friend's hand carried hesitation. Daily life was marked by restraint movements, slower, voices softer, gatherings smaller. Each act of caution was a fragile attempt to build a wall against the invisible tide of contagion. In this way, pestilence was more than an illness. It was an atmosphere, a constant weight pressing down upon the people. It filled their homes with smoke, their streets with silence, their hearts with dread. It shaped their rituals of cleaning, their prayers, their laws, and their very way of perceiving the world. And though centuries have passed, the memory lingers. The way fear itself spread as quickly as the disease, clinging to every object, every sound, every breath of wind. It is a reminder that in the time of the plague, cleanliness was never just about water or soap. It was about finding a way to live within fear, to carve out a sense of safety in a world where everything seemed dangerous. In the age of the plague, when invisible dangers seemed to seep through every doorway and linger in every shadow, the home became both a refuge and a place of unease. People could not see the disease, but they believed it hovered in the air, clung to the walls, and nested in the dark corners of their rooms. And so, with whatever means they had, families tried to cleanse their homes, seeking comfort in rituals, scents, and practices that mixed faith with superstition. For the wealthy, large houses were often swept daily by servants who carried straw brooms across the cold stone floors. The sound was steady and rhythmic, brushing away dust and dirt, though the plague itself could not be touched by such efforts. Still, the act of sweeping gave a sense of order. Windows might be opened, even in chill weather, to let fresh air circulate, though the breeze often carried with it the sharp smells of the street outside: manure, smoke, and rot. Nobles burned incense in their chambers, filling the air with the heavy sweetness of frankincense or myrrh. They believed pleasant scents could push back the miasma, the poisoned air thought to bring sickness. Poorer families, living in 1 or 2 rooms, had fewer means but no less determination. They scattered herbs on the ground, lavender, rosemary, time letting the fragrance rise as people walked across them. Walls might be scrubbed with vinegar, its sour sting biting the nose, believed to purify whatever unseen threat lurked there. A bucket of water, carried from a well, would be dashed against the packed dirt floor, dampening dust and making the room smell of wet earth. These small efforts gave a fragile hope, even when little truly changed. Some families kept fires burning longer than usual, not only for warmth but for cleansing. The smoke, dark and heavy, curled through rafters, seeping into beams and thatch. It left behind a coating of soot, but people felt reassured. In towns, neighbors sometimes walked through their homes with candles or burning herbs, waving the smoke into corners where shadows lay thick. In rural places, Whole households might be fumigated with pungent mixtures, choking the rooms with acrid fumes that burned the throat but promised protection. There were also spiritual cleansings. Priests sometimes blessed homes with holy water, sprinkling it across doorways, walls, and beds. Families clung to the belief that divine grace could shield them from the creeping sickness. Holy symbols, crosses, saints' images, bits of scripture were hung above doors or nailed to wooden beams. The home was not only scrubbed with vinegar and herbs, but fortified with faith. Despite all these efforts, the plague still crept in. Rats scurried across floors. Fleas bit skin unseen. No broom, no herb, no prayer could wholly keep death from crossing the threshold. Yet people continued, sweeping, scrubbing, fumigating, blessing, because to act was to fight despair. Their homes became small fortresses of ritual and hope, where every scent of lavender or curl of smoke was a fragile shield against the darkness beyond. And in the quiet of night, when the sweeping had ceased and only the faint glow of a dying fire remained, families lay close together, breathing in the mingled smells of herbs, vinegar, smoke, and fear. In those dim rooms, one could sense the weight of history. The endless human effort to find safety in the simplest acts of cleanliness. In the centuries of the plague, the world was not only seen and heard, it was smelled. To walk through a medieval town during those years was to step into a landscape thick with odors, some comforting, some repellent, and all believed to carry meaning for health and survival. Among them, the scents of spices, vinegar, and smoke came to dominate daily life, lingering in homes, on clothing, and even in the air of the streets themselves. The theory of miasma, the poisoned air, thought to spread disease, meant that smell was more than a nuisance. It was a matter of life and death. If foul odors could kill, then pleasant or sharp odors might protect. And so, spices, vinegar, and smoke became the invisible armor people wrapped around themselves. A barrier against the unseen. Imagine for a moment the narrow, crooked lanes of a plague-stricken city. The stone walls of houses lean inward, shadows settle in the alleys, and yet the air is alive with fragrance. Wealthy citizens walk with pomanders, small, ornate balls filled with cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and dried rose petals. Each breath carries with it the warm spice of distant lands, a sweet distraction from the reek of refuse and death. Their gloves, cloaks, and even handkerchiefs are steeped in perfumed oils. The smell is rich, layered, and foreign, a reminder of trade routes that stretched across seas, bringing not only luxury, but also a sense of safety. For the poor, spices were beyond reach. Instead, vinegar became their shield. Its sharp, sour bite was thought to cut through pestilence. Homes were scrubbed with it until the very walls seemed to exhale its sting. Cloths soaked in vinegar were held against the nose, damp and acrid, as people walked through crowded streets. Food, when it could be spared, was dressed with it, for vinegar was both flavoring and imagined medicine. Scent lingered on hands, on wood, on skin, a constant reminder of the effort to push sickness away. Smoke, too, filled the world. It drifted from hearths, from braziers, from bundles of herbs thrown deliberately onto flames. Juniper, rosemary, sagewood burned. They produced clouds of fragrance that clung to clothing and hair. In homes, it curled along beams and rafters, leaving them blackened, but it was hoped purified. In churches, censers swung gently, spreading incense across the aisles, mingling sanctity with the need for protection. On city streets, officials sometimes ordered great bonfires, believing that the rising smoke would cleanse the very air. At night, with the glow of flames and the smell of charred wood, people clung to the thought that the smoke carried pestilence away into the sky. The contrasts between rich and poor could be smelled as well as seen. A noble's chamber might reek of cinnamon and rosewater, its heavy sweetness masking decay beyond the walls. Peasant's hut carried the harsher scent of vinegar, smoke, and damp earth. Yet in both places, the same hope lingered that these scents might guard the body and soul. And so, the medieval world during the plague was a world of layered smells. The sweetness of spice, the sting of vinegar, the heaviness of smoke. Together they formed a constant atmosphere, one that clung to clothes and hair, soaked into timber and stone, and settled into memory. Even now, when we read of those days, we can almost imagine the air dense, fragrant, acrid, where fear of death met the human instinct to cleanse and protect. These scents were not simply decoration, they were comfort, ritual, and shield. They were the breath of survival, however fragile, in an age when each inhalation seemed to risk more than one's lungs could bear. In the time of the plague, one could not escape the ever-present burden of waste. To live in a medieval town or city was to share space not only with neighbors and livestock, but with refuse, with filth, and with the constant smell of decay. Cleanliness was never a simple matter of washing one's hands or sweeping one's room. It was a battle against the slow accumulation of dirt, against the flow of sewage that had no proper place to go, against the fear that such foulness was the very substance of disease. Narrow streets twisted through towns, paved in cobbles, or sometimes not paved at all. Between those stones, water and waste gathered, forming stagnant pools that glistened in the dim light. Household scraps were flung from windows, bones, vegetable peels, the slop from cooking pots. Chamber pots were emptied with little care, their contents splashing into gutters or seeping into the earth. At night, one might hear the quiet sound of a shutter opening, followed by the sudden pour of liquid striking the ground below, and then the faint scurry of rats rushing toward the smell. The city breathed with these sounds and smells, a rhythm of living that seemed inescapable. The wealthy had more protection, though never complete. Their larger homes sometimes contained cesspits, deep holes lined with stone where waste was gathered. Servants carried the heavy burden of emptying them. A task done under cover of night, the air thick with the acrid odor of ammonia and decay. Even in castles, where the architecture was more advanced, waste chutes or garderobes led directly down walls, leaving streaks that clung to the masonry. No place was free from the presence of waste. It merely changed its form. The poor, living in cramped wooden houses, had little to shield them. Their floors were of packed earth, sometimes sprinkled with straw to absorb dampness and filth. When the straw grew foul, it was swept aside and replaced, though the smell of rot remained. In villages, manure heaps stood close to cottages, for animals and humans lived in close company. Pigs rooted through refuse, chickens scattered scraps with their claws, and dogs carried bones into corners. Life itself was entangled with waste, every breath a reminder of it. Sanitation, as we might imagine it, was crude, but not absent. In many towns, there were orders that streets should be cleaned, that dung should be removed, that butchers must dispose of offal beyond the walls. Sometimes carts came to carry away filth, creaking wheels echoing through the streets as they hauled waste toward dumping grounds. Yet these efforts were uneven. In times of plague, panic spread faster than regulation, and the carts often overflowed, spilling their burdens back into the alleys they had left. The fear of miasma made the smells themselves terrifying. People pinched herbs beneath their noses, soaked cloths in vinegar, or carried pomanders of spice, convinced that to inhale foulness was to invite death. A noble woman might hold a rosewater-soaked handkerchief to her face as she passed through a street, while a peasant could only hope the smoke from his hearth fire might mask the stench. Yet the smells always returned. They seeped into clothes, into skin, into every stone of the city, rivers and streams, to bore the burden. In towns with waterways, refuse was tossed directly into them, carried away downstream. For a time this seemed a solution, but the water itself soon became dark, sluggish, and rank. Families who relied on wells or rivers sometimes had no choice but to drink from sources tainted with filth. Illness was common, and though the plague itself was not spread by water, the misery of contaminated drink only deepened the suffering. In monasteries, one found stricter order. Latrines were carefully arranged, and monks washed more frequently. Their routines of cleanliness stood in quiet contrast to the chaos of the towns. Yet even there, the fear of contamination lingered. The chanting of prayers mixed with the smell of incense, a reminder that purity of spirit was considered as important as purity of body. The presence of waste shaped the very rhythm of medieval life. Children played among refuse heaps. Merchants swept the thresholds of their shops, but only to push the dirt farther into the street. At night the air cooled, but the smells grew sharper, mingling with wood smoke from countless fires. The sound of trickling gutters, carrying waste toward the outskirts of town, was part of the nocturnal silence, broken only by the rustle of rats. And so, the burden of waste was more than physical. It was psychological, spiritual, and deeply feared. To medieval people, Filth was not merely unpleasant, it was dangerous, a sign of corruption, a visible partner to the plague. Their attempts at sanitation, however imperfect, were born of both necessity and desperation. To sweep a floor, to throw herbs upon refuse, to light a fire and let the smoke roll through rafters, these were not small chores, but gestures of survival. Even now, when we imagine the medieval world, it is the smell that rises first. Pungent, smoky, sour, and unrelenting. It was the background of every life, a burden shared by rich and poor alike, though felt most sharply by those who had least. And within that atmosphere of waste and survival, the plague found its perfect stage, moving silently, unimpeded, through a world already saturated with filth. In the medieval world, hygiene was not a single uniform experience. It shifted with place, with wealth, with the rhythm of daily life. Nowhere was the contrast clearer than between the cloistered walls of monasteries and the open, struggling spaces of peasant villages. In these two worlds, the approach to cleanliness was shaped by belief, by resources, and by necessity, and yet both reveal the deep connection between survival and ritual in the time of the plague. Within the monastery, cleanliness carried not only a physical purpose, but a spiritual weight. Monks rose before dawn, the air cool and damp, their footsteps echoing softly across stone floors. Their lives were ordered by bells, and their routines included washing as part of spiritual discipline. Cloisters often contained lavatoria, long stone troughs where water flowed from spouts of carved stone. The water was cold, often startling to the touch, but monks dipped their hands into it before meals, washing away the dust of labor and prayer alike. In some wealthier monasteries, bathhouses were built, where hot water was heated in great cauldrons, allowing communal bathing at prescribed times. The faint smell of smoke, damp linen, and soap, made from animal fats, lingered in these spaces, a reminder that even in austerity, care was taken to keep the body somewhat clean. Monastic rules often emphasized purity of soul over purity of skin, yet the two were never wholly separate. To cleanse the hands before touching bread was to honor both God and community. To wash feet, whether one's own or those of a guest, was a gesture of humility and devotion. Herbs, too, played their part. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were grown in monastery gardens, not only for medicine, but to sweeten the air. Smoke from censers of incense drifted through chapels, mingling with the faint, sharp scent of vinegar used to clean stone floors. In these ordered spaces, hygiene was ritualized, disciplined, and supported by resources that most ordinary people could not dream of. Beyond the monastery walls, in the peasant villages that dotted the countryside, the reality was far rougher. A peasant family's home might be a single room of wattle and daub, its floor-packed earth scattered with straw. Livestock sometimes shared the same space, their warmth useful in cold months. The smell of animals, damp straw, smoke from a central hearth, and the sour temps of unwashed bodies filled the air. Water for washing was drawn from a well, often shared by the whole village, and it was heavy to carry. Washing the entire body was rare. Instead, people rinsed their hands and faces when they could, often with cold water that left the skin numb in winter. Soap was expensive and scarce in villages. Peasants sometimes used sand, ash, or even rough cloths to scrub away grime. Clothes, when washed at all, were soaked in streams or beaten against stones, the sound of the cloth slapping water echoing through the air. The smell of damp wool lingered long after. For many, a clean shift of linen was the nearest thing to bathing. Freshly laundered garments carried their own sense of renewal. During times of plague, the contrast deepened. Monasteries, though not immune, often attempted to impose stricter routines, more washing, more incense, more fumigation of halls with burning herbs. The echo of chanting prayers was joined by the hiss of boiling vinegar, poured across surfaces in hopes of cleansing away contagion. In villages, fear was present, but resources were fewer. Families scattered herbs on their floors, burned bundles of sage in the hearth, or clutched sprigs of rosemary at their belts. Their cleansing rituals were modest, but carried the same intention, to ward off invisible death. The difference between monastery and village was not only in practice, but in atmosphere. In monasteries, The order of bells, prayers, and rituals gave structure to cleanliness. The cloisters smelled faintly of damp stone, incense, and herbs. In villages, the smells were earthier, harsher animal dung, wood smoke, sour ale, and the dampness of unwashed skin. Yet in both places, the effort was real. To the monk, washing was part of prayer. To the peasant, washing was part of endurance. And so when we imagine hygiene during the time of the plague, we see two worlds side by side. One enclosed and disciplined, where stone walls held gardens of herbs and fountains of water, where prayers mingled with the smell of soap. The other, humble and exposed, where washing was rare, where animals and humans shared warmth, and where survival meant making do with the simplest of resources. Both worlds remind us of the endless human effort to be clean, to push back against filth, and to find meaning in the act of washing, whether for God, for health, or simply for a fragile sense of hope in a world shadowed by fear. When the Black Plague swept across medieval Europe, few figures stood more visibly between the sick and the fearful than the physicians and the plague doctors. Their presence was marked by long cloaks, gloved hands, and, in later years, the unmistakable beaked mask. These men, trained in varying degrees of medical knowledge, tried to bring order to a world collapsing under pestilence. Cleanliness, or what they understood by it, became both a duty and a performance, a way to reassure patients, as well as themselves, that some defense could be mounted against the relentless tide of death. Physicians of the wealthier classes carried themselves with authority. In their chambers, shelves were lined with jars of dried herbs, oils, and powders, their scents filling the air with mixtures of sweet, bitter, and acrid notes. A wealthy patient might be examined in a bedchamber perfumed with incense or rosewater, the windows draped with cloths soaked in vinegar to keep out bad air. The physician's robes, often long and dark, were not washed in the way we think of cleanliness today, but they were sometimes sprinkled with aromatic waters or even dusted with crushed herbs to counteract odors. Gloves of soft leather shielded the hands, and small pomanders dangled from belts, releasing the sharp spice of cloves or nutmeg with every movement. Poor or sick had less access to such ritualized medicine. A peasant family might scrape together coins to summon a physician, but more often they saw only the local barber surgeon, who doubled as healer and tooth puller. His ideas of cleanliness were more practical, involving the wiping of instruments with cloths, sometimes soaked in wine or vinegar. The sharp tang of alcohol or sour vinegar filled the air as knives, razors, or bleeding bowls were rinsed between uses. It was not sterilization in the modern sense. It was something in instinctive recognition that fluid and metal carried unseen dangers. The most iconic image of plague-time cleanliness, or the attempt at it, was the plague doctor himself. His costume was not so much a uniform of medicine as of fear and ritual protection. Over his body he wore a long waxed cloak, sometimes treated with oils to make it resistant to damp. His hands were covered in gloves. Most striking of all was the mask, with its long bird-like beak. Into this hollow space, attendants stuffed herbs, spices, or vinegar-soaked sponges, rosemary, thyme, cloves, juniper, or even camphor. Each breath the doctor drew was filtered through a pungent barrier, believed to cleanse the air before it reached the lungs. The smell would have been overwhelming, sharp and constant, yet perhaps reassuring when the streets outside reeked of death and refuse. Inside plague houses, the doctor's routine was stark and unnerving. He moved from bed to bed, sometimes touching patients only with a wooden stick, avoiding contact with bare hands. Instructed families to fumigate rooms with smoke, to wash floors with vinegar, to burn soiled bedding. The heavy odor of smoke and sourness filled such houses, mingling with the stench of sweat and sickness. The doctor himself would leave reeking of herbs, his clothing stiff with wax, his gloves smelling faintly of leather and vinegar. Cleanliness here was less about shining surfaces and more about erecting barriers, physical and aromatic, between the living and the dying. Physicians also turned to bloodletting, purging, and the balancing of humors, practices rooted in ancient theories. Cleanliness in these treatments was rudimentary. Cups and blades were rinsed, sometimes heated briefly in flames, their edges dulled by repeated use. Cloths soaked in wine or vinegar wiped away blood. To the patient, The sting of vinegar and the warmth of fire seemed protective, though infection often followed. Yet even so, these gestures were acts of care, meant to separate the sick body from its sickness, to restore order through ritual and repetition.
Ow.
There was also the cleansing of the air itself. Doctors advised families to burn bundles of aromatic woods and herbs in their homes' juniper branches crackling in the hearth, rosemary filling the rafters with fragrant smoke. In cities, great bonfires were ordered in the squares, their flames stretching upward, sending showers of sparks into the night. People stood close, breathing deeply, convinced that the warmth and the smoke washed the lungs of invisible corruption. In monasteries and wealthier households, censers swung in rooms where the sick lay,
Ow.
their smoke curling in soft patterns above the beds. The hiss of burning herbs, the thick scent of incense, these were as much a part of treatment as any potion or draught. The contrast between rich and poor patients was sharp. The wealthy were surrounded by perfumed cloths, silver vessels of rosewater, and doctors in elaborate dress. The poor relied on rough fumigations, vinegar-soaked rags, and the visits of men whose knowledge was more practical than scholarly. Yet in both cases, the aim was the same: to cleanse, to purify, to set a barrier against the unseen hand of death. Even when these efforts failed, they often did the gestures mattered. A doctor washing his hands in vinegar after leaving a house, a barber rinsing a blade in wine, a family waving smoke into the corners of a room. Each action carried hope. Each was a reminder that human beings, even in the darkest of hours, sought ways to restore order, to shield themselves with ritual, and to define what it meant to be clean when the world itself seemed poisoned. In the stillness of those plague years, when the tolling of church bells marked death upon death, the faint smells of vinegar, herbs, and smoke lingered as quiet witnesses to the struggle. They remind us now of how deeply people longed for protection, how earnestly they tried to cleanse themselves and their world even, when true safety was far beyond their reach. As we bring this slow and winding journey to a close, it is worth pausing to reflect on what it truly meant to live during the years of the Black Plague time, when cleanliness was uncertain, when water and air were feared as much as the unseen sickness itself, and when hygiene was more a matter of belief and tradition than science. Daily existence unfolded under a shadow of dirt, smells, and disease, yet people pressed on, clinging to rituals, customs, and small comforts in the hope of keeping their bodies and souls safe. What becomes clear is that hygiene during this time was not simply about soap or water, but about survival, both physical and spiritual. Washing was a careful balance between necessity and danger. Bathing, once considered a source of health, became suspect, even avoided. Herbs, smoke, vinegar, and religious rites served in place of modern sanitation, their scents drifting through homes and streets, offering reassurance, even if little protection. The divide between rich and poor shaped how people approached cleanliness, yet neither class was immune to the reach of pestilence. And yet within this world of grime and fear, there was resilience. Monks kept to their ordered routines, peasants endured their muddy villages, and physicians tried, however imperfectly, to bring order to the chaos of disease. In bathhouses, markets, and homes, people carried on, searching for meaning and comfort in small acts of purification. The endurance of these communities through dirt, stench, and unimaginable loss reminds us of humanity's capacity to adapt, to cling to hope, and to find ways of living even in the harshest of times. The Black Plague reshaped how people thought about their bodies, their souls, and the unseen world around them. And though their efforts may seem strange to us today, they reveal a deep and enduring truth, that in the face of fear, people will always search for ways, however imperfect, to feel clean, safe, and whole.